What does it look like when an entire identity gets rewritten mid-season? Picture a man who's been quietly stitching a team together for a quarter century, scouts reports in his pocket, draft boards folded inside his head, and then imagine the owner stepping into the room and saying, "It's time to change." That's Chris Grier's goodbye. Not explosive, not scandalous, just the end of a long, complicated chapter that leaves more questions than answers. You don't notice a front office until things go wrong. For 26 years, Grier was the background hum of the Dolphins, a scout who rose to GM in 2016, the guy who helped build the rosters that gave Miami flirtations with greatness. When a team wins, executives are footnotes. When it starts losing, they become protagonists. The Dolphins are 2-7 this year. Losses pile up like unpaid bills. Fans boo, pundits sharpen their timelines, and suddenly, the ledger turns on a man who had been there through the highs and the hopes. Mutually part ways, the statement read. A phrase that hides a stack of meetings, arguments, and sleepless nights. It's polite, but it's also final. The optics matter. An owner who says you must improve in 2025, 2026, and beyond is not just punting on this season. He's recalibrating the franchise's future. Stephen Ross signed that note. He named Champ Kelly interim GM. That's a signal, not merely personnel accounting. The narrative flips from let's tweak to let's audit. And the timing, with the trade deadline breathing down the throat of the roster, turns the moment from internal housekeeping into public theater. Are you a buyer who patches holes or a seller who tears down and starts over? The new interim GM has to decide in hours what the old GM debated for months. But let's pull the camera back from titles and into the locker room because that's where the consequences live. Coaches coach, GMs build, players execute. When leadership changes, everything shakes. The head coach, Mike McDaniel, he's staying, at least through the end of this season. That's the sentence that makes this whole thing feel like a half-finished movie. The architect exits and the stage director remains. It's an odd split of blame and faith. Blame the roster, keep the play caller. For the fans, for the players, that's both calming and maddening. It preserves continuity but raises an obvious question. Can the man calling the plays really be judged separate from the roster that's failing to execute them? Let's be honest. The Dolphins' problems aren't a single headline. The offensive line has been shaky for seasons. The secondary has holes that get exposed. Cohesion is frayed. You need both a GM who drafts and a coach who adapts. When one leaves and the other stays, you're left to wonder whether the franchise believes a different set of personnel can make the same system sing. And when the owner says, "We must improve," he's saying exactly that. Somebody needs to make different choices. Whether that will be the incoming front office or the coach adjusting on the fly is the drama we'll watch unfold over the next weeks. There's also the public theater of trust. Ross thanked Grier for his service. That's gracious language covering an ugly business reality. Sports are ruthless. GMs are judged on drafts, on free agent signings, on whether they can build depth for January's grind. Grier had years, he had hits and misses. The misses are what swallow patience. When the scoreboard reads 2-7, the margin for error shrinks to nothing. Owners get nervous, owners spend money, owners fire people. Ross chose a middle path. Remove the architect, keep the coach. Maybe he thinks continuity in coaching stabilizes players through a messy, transitional week. Maybe he's betting that a new personnel mind will fix holes without upending what McDaniel built. Or maybe it's simply political, an attempt to show action while keeping the narrative thread alive until a fuller evaluation in the offseason. Let's not be cruel. Change of this magnitude matters for the people it touches. Scouts who spent months evaluating prospects now have to explain their logic to a new voice. Draft boards shift. Trade proposals get revisited. Agents start calling. For players, uncertainty is emotional tax. Will the new decision makers value the same traits? Will a young linebacker who was a favorite become suddenly expendable? Those are not abstract worries. They're livelihood questions that hum in the hallways of the practice facility. And then there's the fan base, the loudest judge in this city. Fans who storm the stadium wanting a championship feel betrayed by slow slides. They're angry. They're tired of being promised seasons that slip away. But they also want a plan. Moving pieces mid-season without a coherent message breeds suspicion. That's why Ross's statement matters. He anchored the exit as a step toward a clear vision for the future. It's corporate speak, but it's also a promise. Promises require proof. The next weeks will show whether this was a decisive step or a PR bandage. Let's dig into the practical reality. The trade deadline. If Miami becomes a seller, veterans with tradable value turn into currency for draft capital. That's a short-term pain for potential long-term gain. The interim GM must quickly assess, do we cash in for picks and start a rebuild, or do we buy to salvage this strange season? Either call has ripple effects beyond wins and losses. It changes the draft board profile, alters salary cap math, and shapes the kind of players a coach like McDaniel will have next season. There's also a human story threaded through this. Chris Grier is more than a job title. He's someone who built relationships, who watched players grow from high school stars into men who carry their community's hopes. For him, a mutual parting is a private grief masked with public civility. He's walked the field, watched tape at 2 a.m., argued at draft tables, and weathered critique. Leaving doesn't erase those contributions. It reframes them. And Champ Kelly stepping in won't erase what Grier built. It will reinterpret it. So what does the remaining arc look like? For McDaniel, this is a test not only of X's and O's, but of leadership under pressure. Keep the team focused, steady the locker room, and show that the system can deliver even as the scaffolding of personnel is reevaluated. For the interim GM, it's triage first. Evaluate the assets, decide who markets them, and set a rough timeline toward a permanent hire who shares a vision. For the fans, it's patience and skepticism in equal measure. Watch the moves, measure the results, and demand a blueprint you can believe in. And for everyone watching, there's the quieter truth. Franchises are messy organisms. They don't turn on a dime. They are shaped by owners' mercies, scouts' hunches, coaches' philosophies, and players' resilience. Changing one part doesn't immediately fix the others, but it can set a new direction. Sometimes the hard, public act of change is what finally forces the private, necessary work. If you want a single scene to hold on to, imagine the team returning to practice the day after the announcement. The field half empty, the sunlight brutal, the players moving like wind-up toys until they find rhythm. Coaches point, quarterbacks yell cadence, linemen reset pads. In those small, repetitive motions is whether a franchise can convert a moment of upheaval into a future. That's where trust is rebuilt, not in statements or headlines, but in reps, in evaluations, in honest conversations. This chapter doesn't end neatly. It's a hinge. It will swing one way if the Dolphins use this as a hard reset, aligning coach and personnel with clarity. It will swing another if continuity becomes inertia and the same problems persist. Either way, the choice has been made. Chris Grier's long tenure is over, and a new puzzle begins. The team that stands after the cut will reveal what kind of season and what kind of future Miami truly wants. In sports like in life, endings are rarely tidy. They're just the start of the next harder job, building something worth believing in. You could feel the whole thing unravel in slow motion, not with a single dramatic press conference, but with a quiet line in an owner's statement and the sudden, odd silence of a front office that's been part of a team for a quarter century. The Miami Dolphins and GM Chris Grier have mutually agreed to part ways, a decision Stephen Ross framed as the start of the work to get this franchise back where it belongs. MiamiDolphins.com. It's the sort of move that reads like both consequence and calculation. Champ Kelly, a buttoned-up executive with previous front office chops, is stepping in as interim general manager to steer the club through the trade deadline scramble and the next few weeks of roster triage. In practical terms, Kelly is now the phone on the owner's desk that teams will call, and whatever the Dolphins do between now and the deadline will bear his thumbprint. NFL.com, and yet the most surreal piece of the headline is what didn't happen. Mike McDaniel, the coach whose offense once felt like a permanent national headline, will remain the team's head coach at least through the rest of this season. That's Adam Schefter's reporting, and it tells you how ownership decided to act quickly on the people who build the roster while leaving the person who runs the day-to-day in place, for now. It's an ownership play that buys time and preserves continuity, but it also leaves open a big question: why replace the architect and keep the architect's lead contractor? ESPN.com. Put it in context. This isn't abstract. The Dolphins sit in the kind of hole that makes owners and boards nervous. A 2-7 start and a brutal 28-6 home loss to the Baltimore Ravens that made the season feel less like an off-week hiccup and more like a trend. That record and that collapse are what drove the ownership decision. A longtime executive out, an interim in, and the coach spared immediate firing but not immune to consequences. The Finsider. So what does this actually mean for the team? On the field, in the locker room, and at the trade table? First, the roster logic. Grier's fingerprints are on the draft classes, the signings, the depth charts. When a GM leaves midseason, it's usually because the owner has lost confidence in that long-term construction. An interim GM typically has two playbooks: be conservative and preserve assets, or be aggressive and try to buy a season. Champ Kelly's early moves, whether he trades a mid-round pick for a lineman or hangs tight to draft capital, will signal which route Miami takes. The Finsider. Second, the optics in the locker room. Players watch moves like this more closely than fans do. Who left, who stayed, and how the front office frames the change will ripple into trust, accountability, and buy-in. Keeping McDaniel is a signal. The owner still has faith in the coach's schematic identity, but coaches buy time with results. McDaniel's remaining employment for the season is conditional in reality, a for now that depends on visible improvement and clearer growth in short order. ESPN.com. Third, the practical football side. The Dolphins' most obvious holes this year: offensive line continuity, a defense that hasn't consistently closed, and special teams gaffes are the kinds of problems a GM is supposed to plan against in the draft and via personnel. If Champ Kelly moves to buy a lineman or defensive piece, it will be because ownership decided the short-term fix is worth the long-term cost. If he doesn't, Ross may be signaling that the rebuild